Welcome back to this new tutorial. Today I want to show you how we can create a fully procedural cactus with geometry nodes in Blender. So let's get started. Okay, so let's just start with this fresh blend file, and I'm just going to delete everything that we don't need. And first of all, let's just open up a geometry node editor. Now we need any object to work with, so press Shift A and bring in any mesh object you want. It doesn't really matter what kind of object it is, because we're now going to create a geometry node tree and delete the mesh input as we're not going to use it. Let's just quickly rename this to cactus. And first of all, we want to create the base shape. For this, press Shift A and bring in a curve line. Connect this to the group output, and I want to create this in a realistic scale. So let's add the end to a height of 10 centimeters. So this is going to be the height of our cactus. So let's turn this into a better shape. And for this, we want to convert it from a curve into a mesh. And right here, we have the option to add a profile curve. The closest option that we have available that looks like a cactus is a star node. So let's just take a look at this. Also make it way smaller, so I think I'm gonna make it 6 centimeters and 8 centimeters. And this looks quite nice, however, I think the corners are too sharp. So in order to make a curve smoother, there is a very easy method by just bringing in a set handle type node and also a set spline type node. And now simply switch it from poly to Bezier and we get this really soft curve. Now I think this is a bit too soft, so let's find something in between. For this we need the set handle position node, which allows us to individually set the position of the left and the right handle positions. So let's start with the left, press Shift A, and if I bring in a position node and plug this into the position, you can see that I get completely sharp edges. So again, we want something in between. So in addition to the position node, we also need a curve handle position node. Now we want to combine those two, and for this, bring in a mix node, change it from float to vector, combine the two, make sure that you use the left one, and add the result to the position. And now we have this factor that allows us to adjust the smoothness of the left handles. So next we just need to do this for the right one as well. So let's duplicate this. Also duplicate the rest of the setup, plug it in here and make sure that you switch from left to right. Right here as well, select right. And now we have those two factors that allow us to control the smoothness of those corners. So let me just quickly reorganize this. And instead of controlling the left and right individually, I want to be able to control the inner part and the outer part of our star separately. This is quite easy to do, so let's bring in another mix node. Use this outer point output from the star node as the factor and plug the result into both mix nodes. And now we have one factor for the inner smoothness and one for the outer. So with this setup, let's just turn this into a frame. So select all of those nodes and press Ctrl J. And with the shortcut F2, let's rename this to Smooth Star. Now let's go back to what we had up here and use this output as the profile curve. So let's take a look at this now. And this is the start of our base shape. Now, of course, we don't want the same thickness all the way through. So first of all, let me quickly enable the wireframe so we can see a bit more. And right now you can see we only have horizontal resolution, but no vertical resolution. So let's fix this. And after the curve line, bring in a resample curve node. And this count value here now allows us to define the resolution of the cactus. I'm just going to leave it at the default of 10. And now in order to vary the thickness, we want to bring in a set radius node. Bring it back to the default of 1. And if I play around with this, you can see that we can adjust the thickness. Now we don't want the same thickness all the way through. So let's bring in a spline parameter node. And when we use this factor output, we get a value from 0 to 1. This is better, but still not what we want. So let's also bring in a float curve node. And now we can nicely control the shape of this cactus by playing around with those handles. And we can simply shape the cactus to our needs. So just play around with this curve until you have something that you like. So I think I'm gonna go with this shape, but I also wanna increase the resolution of the star. So let's go down here and increase the count to, let's say 12. So let's quickly reorganize our node setup, and everything up here I want to add to a frame as well with the shortcut Ctrl J, F2 to rename it, and I'm gonna call it base shape. So next let's create the spines. For this I'm gonna add in a new object, which is gonna be the icosphere. Let's take a look at this. It's way too big by default, so let's decrease the scale to 0.001. And if I get too close, you can see that the icosphere disappears. So let's press N to open up the side panel. And under view, decrease this clip start value. So now we can get much closer. So those are the knobs that we're gonna add to our cactus, but we also need the spines. So let's add in another curve line node. Let's take a look at this. Also make it really, really small, 0.001 meters. And in order to give it thickness, use the curve to mesh node. Once more, we need a profile curve, and this time it's gonna be a curve circle. Change the resolution all the way down to 3. Plug it into the profile curve, and it is way too big, so let's bring the radius down to 0.0002, which is still too big. So let's bring down this number even more. Again, we want it to be wide on the bottom and pointy on top. So again, we're gonna use a set curve radius node and use the spline parameter. Plug the factor into the radius. This is inverted, so bring in another float curve node and just reverse those two handles. So now we have those nice spikes. So let's just quickly frame this. So all of this right here, Ctrl J, F2 to rename and call it spine. Then go back to the knob that we created before with this icosphere, and we want to add those spines to this knob. For this we need an instance on point node and use this spine as the instance. Now this already works, however they aren't rotated correctly, so let's bring in a normal node. Use this in combination with an align rotation to vector. Make sure that the normal is plugged into the vector and then plug the rotation into the rotation. And now all these spines are pointing outward. So let's connect them up with the original knob with a join geometry node. So now both of them are combined, and I actually only want the spines on top and remove the ones that are on the bottom, because this is going to be inside of the cactus. To do so, we're going to use this selection input of the instance on point node in combination with a position node. Then also use a separate XYZ node and use the set in combination with a math node. Change it from add to greater than. Make sure that this threshold is set to 0 and plug the value into the selection. And now we only get the spines that are pointing upwards. Maybe we can increase the resolution of the icosphere so we get a bit more points. And I think I want to make them a bit longer as well. So let's increase this end value to 0.003. Alright, so with this ready, let's create another frame. So select all of them, Ctrl J, F2 to rename, and this is gonna be the knobs. Now we just need to add them to the rest of our cactus. So let's quickly reorganize everything. Go back to the output of this base shape. Let's quickly take a look at this again. And right here we want to add those knobs with the spines on each of those points along the outer edge. For this we're also going to use an instance on point node and use the knobs as the instance. Once more, let's combine this with the base shape. So use a join geometry node and combine both the instance on points and the curve to mesh node. And now we have way too much of those knobs. I only want them on the outer edges. So how can we get rid of the rest? This is surprisingly easy to do. Just go back to our smooth star group, and here we have this outer point selection that we can use as an attribute. So let's use a store named attribute node. Let's give it a name called outer points and just connect this into the value. Now we can go back to the instance on points node and use this as the selection. So press Shift A and bring in a named attribute node. Select the outer points attribute and plug the attribute into the selection. And this doesn't really do anything yet, but if we bring in a math node as well, change it from add to greater than, and bring the value up to 0.9999 or something really close to 1, you can see that we now only have the points that are on the most outer point of the cactus. Before we continue with the tutorial, I just quickly wanted to mention that you can download all of the 3D assets I ever created completely for free from my Blender Kit profile. You can find the link in the video description. Additionally, with this link, you'll also get a 10% discount on a premium Blender Kit subscription, which gives you access to even more 3D models, materials, and so on that you can download with Blender Kit. They also have an amazing add-on that allows you to directly import those assets into Blender. So make sure to get the 10% discount with the link in the video description. But now let's get back to the tutorial. So this is working nicely, however we also need to fix the rotation of those knobs so that they are always pointing outwards. And for this we're going to do the same thing that we already did earlier, bring in a normal node, combine this with an align rotation to vector node and plug this into the rotation. Make sure that the normal is plugged into the vector and now this works. I think the wireframe is a bit confusing, so let's just remove this from the viewport overlays so we can see it a bit better. And I also think that those knobs are a bit too big, so let's go back in here and decrease the radius of the icosphere. But instead, I want to enlarge the spines. So let's go down here and increase this curve line length to 0.006. And I think now this looks a lot nicer. Now we are already quite close to finishing this cactus. However, there are two more things that I want to do. First of all, I want to remove the knobs from the bottom. And in the top, we have many overlapping knobs. And I want to merge all of them into one. To do so, let's first start by merging the top. And we really only want to merge the vertices on top. So let's create another attribute right here at the base shape after the resample curve. So add a new store named attribute node, bring it in right here, and I'm gonna call this end. Then combine this with a endpoint selection node, which allows us to select the start and end of the curve. And in this case, we only want the end, so bring the start size to 0 and plug this into the value. So now after this curve to mesh node, we can bring in a merge by distance node. Make sure that both outputs stay connected. So we had one here and one into the joint geometry node. So we can cut the other one. And now the issue with this merge by distance node is that it's not only merging the vertices on top, but everything else as well. That's why we created this attribute, which we can now use. So add in a named attribute node, select the end, and use this as the selection for the merge by distance. And now only this top part gets merged, maybe increase the distance so that it is surely merged. So this worked, however, the knob is now completely removed from the top, but I still want one in there. To fix this, let's go back to the instance on point node. Maybe we can quickly reorganize this with a reroute node so that it is a bit better visible. And right here, after the first named attribute, we want to duplicate this and change it to end. Then duplicate this math node and change it from greater than to add and simply add the outer points together with the end attribute. And now we have our top knob back. Now the other thing that I said I want to do is remove the knobs from the bottom. And this is very similar to what we just did. So just duplicate this store named attribute node. Instead of end, we want to call it start. Then also duplicate this endpoint selection node and this time change the start size to 1 and the end size to 0 and just connect this up to the value. So now we can also use this start attribute. Again, we're going to go back here. Let's duplicate this end attribute, rename it to start, and also duplicate this add node. This time we don't want to add, instead we want to subtract it. Place this in here, and now all the knobs from the bottom are removed. So let's also frame up those last nodes, select all of them, press Ctrl J, F2 to rename, and this is going to be the knobs distribution. Alright, so that's basically it. But one more thing I want to do is shade the icosphere smooth as well. So let's go to the knobs, and right after the icosphere, I'm going to add in a set shade smooth node. Make sure that we add both connections, and now this is nicely shaded. So that is basically the node setup that we're going to use for the cactus. but I also want to add a few attributes to the group output so we can conveniently control our cactus directly from the geometry nodes options. So let's quickly decide which parameters we want to be able to control. So first of all, I think this is definitely the resolution of this star, so we can add more or less rows to this cactus. So let's bring in a group input node, connect those points up, and if you press N to open up the side panel, we can rename those group sockets. So I'm gonna call this cactus star resolution. Then I want to also be able to control the vertical resolution. So let's go to the base shape, and right here we want to control this count. So let's bring in another group input node, connect this up, and I'm going to rename this one to cactus vertical resolution. I also want to control the sharpness of those corners. So let's go back to our smooth star group, and on this mix node right here we can control the hardness. So let's bring in another group input, connect the A and the B, and instead of using them as regular values, I want to change the subtype to factor and make sure that they have a value range from 0 to 1. Let's do this for B as well, change it to factor and limit the range from 0 to 1. Then also rename this to smoothness inner and smoothness outer. So now those values right here are limited between 0 and 1. And the last parameter I want to add is the length of those spines. We could work with this radius right here. However, I think it's easier if we play around with the scale in the instance on points node. So on the group sockets, add in another one, choose input, make sure that you have float selected, and I'm going to rename this to spine scale. Give the default value of 1 and then bring in another group input node and plug the spine scale into the scale of this instance on point node. Currently we have a value of 0, so everything disappeared, but we can simply bring this back now, and we can now easily adjust the size of those spines. So that's the final geometry node setup. I'm just gonna quickly go through it so you can take a screenshot if you didn't see anything. Or if you want to, you can also download my final file with the link in the video description. Okay, so now there's one more thing to do, which is to add the shader. So let's switch to viewport shading preview. And currently we don't have any materials. So let's add in 3 new materials. The first one is going to be the base. Then I want to add a separate material for the knobs and one more for the spines. So let's start with the base. So let's go to the joint geometry in the knobs distribution node, and the top input of this joint geometry node should have a set material node, and right here we can select the base. So I want to give this darkish green color, which is typical for a cactus. Then next let's add the knobs. So go to the end output of the knobs where we have this joint geometry node, add in another set material node, and for the first input we want to use the knobs, then duplicate this for the second input, and right here we want to use the spines. So for the knobs I want to use this darkish color, we can't really see it anyways, and then for the spines I want to go slightly yellow orange and then also quite dark. So I think this already looks quite nice. Maybe we can remove even more saturation, make it a bit darker, or maybe it's nicer if it is a bit brighter, less saturated. You can play around with this until you have something that you like. So that's basically it for our customizable cactus. Let me play around with those values. Maybe I want to increase the resolution a bit. Again, here you can play around with it as much as you want until you have something that you like. And I'm just going to model a pot real quick. So with Shift A, I'm going to add in a new cylinder. Then tab into edit mode, G set 1 to move it up. And I'm going to delete this top face. So X to delete the face only. Then let's scale this down till it matches with our cactus. So maybe something like this. And I'm going to move this cactus up. Let's apply the scale. And I think I'm just going to scale it down a bit on the bottom. Then add a loop cut and add this little ridge at the end. Use Alt E and extrude the faces along the normals. So I can nicely extrude it just up here. Then select this inner edge loop extrude it down, maybe scale it in a bit and use the shortcut Ctrl F to add a grid fill. Then we also need two materials for this. One of them is going to be the soil and the other one is the pot. Then let's assign this inner part to the soil. Ctrl I to invert the selection and assign the rest to the pot. So for the soil, I want this dark brownish color. And for the pot, I think I'm just going to go with this black color. Right click and also enable auto smooth. And now we have our nice little cactus. Again, if you want to download my final result, you can do so with the link in the video description. That's it for this tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. And don't forget that you can get a 10% discount on a premium Blender Kit subscription with the link in the video description. Or you can just download my 3D assets completely for free. Thank you very much for watching. I am Nick and see you in the next one.